Thanks for attending it. I understand it's a very stressful time for everyone at the moment with the exams. So I will keep you half an hour, I guess, and then we'll have time for questions. So I'm going to whiz through some of the stuff that I talk about in my book, The Secret Anarchy of Science, which is really about scientists behaving badly, hence the title. So what I'm really going to talk about, in a sense, is what are scientists like. And I'm going to apologise now because I'm going to have to keep going back and forth because my remote control isn't working at all. So that'll probably screw up the video. So my first question that I kind of wanted to get across really is this question of what are scientists actually like? The best people to talk to, if you want to kind of get into our minds about what scientists are like, our cultural perception of scientists, the best people to ask are children, and you can ask them some interesting questions. One of the questions you can ask them is this: spot the scientists. So you give them this kind of array of faces, and you can say to primary school children, "Oh, tell me which of these are scientists and which aren't scientists." Okay, and they always come out with this answer, which is kind of interesting. So they would say, for instance, that these two guys here at the end of the bottom here are not scientists. Okay, they would say that the woman at the top there, second from there, she's not a scientist. And when you ask them this, in the end, you get down to the answer that they give you. And what they say is, well, look, those people are smiling, and scientists don't smile. So we have, from a very young age, this kind of cultural perception that scientists are very serious people, and you wouldn't ever catch them smiling. Children are very useful as well in something that's called the Draw a Scientist test. And this has been done in all kinds of cultures across the world. It's been done since the 1950s, in fact. And when you ask primary school children to draw a scientist, what you get is a male, for a start, glasses, usually bald or with crazy hair, nothing normal. There's always a lab coat. Usually there's a pocket with pens in. You can see there's one there. And you get this kind of stereotype that comes out from every primary school child, gives you this kind of shorthand of what a scientist is. And this is our kind of cultural baggage that we're dealing with from a very early age. What's interesting is when you ask adults to draw a scientist, and this was a test that was done in I think it was Central Park in New York. They went out and said, oh, to the public, draw us a scientist. You get exactly the same thing, with some embellishments like no pants. I don't know what that really means. But you get this kind of lab coat, facial hair, spectacles, sort of crazy hair, this sort of sense of not being quite normal. Not quite a normal, there's always something odd about the scientist, something peculiar about the scientist. And this, I think, is a problem. And I'll tell you why I think it's a problem with the help of this fantastic graph, which is probably the best graph in science. So what this graph tells you is about our affinity and familiarity with things, okay, as they become more and more like humans. So along this x-axis we've got human likeness. So here, very like a human, and then on the y-axis is familiarity, how much we like these things, okay. And generally, as you get more and more like a human in the representation of something, we like it a bit more. So an industrial robot down here, not very human-like, and we don't really feel much affinity with it. Okay, and then you move up. Now the solid line is things that keep still. So you get a stuffed animal, and we like stuffed animals, and human beings sort of feel this affinity with stuffed animals. And then they get a bit too like human beings, and we actually like them less and less, and it drops down. And so we get this situation where we've got this kind of this valley here. And when things get too human, they become a bit uncanny to us. So this is known as uncanny valley. And actually, uncanny valley is even deeper for things that don't keep still, things that move around. So you can see there at the bottom we've got zombies. Now zombies are very like humans in a way, but actually not completely like humans, not 100% like humans, and they move around. And we really don't like zombies. Okay, so that's at the bottom of uncanny valley. And corpses, they keep still, so we don't mind that quite so much, funnily enough. But they're sitting sort of in uncanny valley, and then in the top right you get a healthy person, and we're happy being around a healthy person again. So this graph actually sort of illustrates for me the problem that we have, because when you get into uncanny valley and you get a human being there, you get something like this. This is Tom Hanks in the Polar Express. And actually, when people watched this film, they said there's something just really weird and uncomfortable about it, and they didn't like it. And the film actually sort of had a lot of problems with people just sort of not... a friend of mine actually said, he was watching me give this talk, and he said, I finally understand why my child wailed through the entire film in the cinema. And one of the reviewers said, basically Tom Hanks comes across as a bit creepy. And there's something about being sort of human, but not quite human-like, that is a little bit creepy and we're a bit uncomfortable with it. And that, I am suggesting, is exactly where scientists find themselves. Scientists are in many ways, in our sort of popular perception, a little bit uncanny, a bit non-human, a bit weird. But actually, you know, real scientists, in terms of, you know, the human beings that do science, not the caricatures that we kind of think of when we come across scientists, they're actually quite normal and quite interesting and sometimes quite daring and heroic people. Now, I haven't got time, I'm afraid, to take you through all these stories. But I can give you some examples of, maybe I'll talk about Werner Forssmann. He's my kind of favourite scientist. Werner Forssmann invented a procedure which is called heart catheterization. It's when you put a tube up an artery through into the human heart, and you can use it for drug delivery or you can use it for diagnosis of illnesses. Now, in the 1920s, he was a junior doctor in a hospital in Eberswalde, Germany, and he saw this picture, which was vets catheterizing the heart of a horse. And at the time, at the end of the 1920s, nobody had ever touched the human heart, a living human heart, because it was thought that if you do anything to the heart, then you'll send it into spasms, you'll disrupt the rhythms, and actually the patient will die. And when Forssmann saw this picture, he said, if vets can do this to horses, then surely we can do it to human beings. And so he went to his boss at the hospital and said, look, I want to do a catheterization on a human being. And his boss said, absolutely not, you know, we don't do that. That's just not how we operate. And he said, well, you know, maybe we could do it on a patient we've got who's already dying, so the outcome would be the same. And his boss said, no, absolutely not, we're not doing it. And so Forssmann said, well, maybe I could do it on myself. Why don't I do it on myself? And his boss said, no, you can't do that. It's unethical. We can't sanction it in the hospital. It's not going to happen. So Forssmann, being a good scientist as he was, it was completely disregarding of authority and decided that he was going to do it on himself. And all that he needed was basically a sterile rubber tube that he could insert into his arm. And he knew that they could be found in the operating theatre. So actually all he really needed was the keys to the operating theatre. So being a logical-minded man, he thought, well, who's got the keys to the operating theatre? And he realised that the chief nurse had a key to the operating theatre. So he asked her out on a date. And so he took her to dinner and started basically, you know, romancing her. Her name was Gerda Ditson. And over a series of dinners, he found out that actually she wanted to be a doctor. She didn't want to stay in nurse. She wanted to kind of progress her career. So he started lending her textbooks and kind of, you know, helping her to formulate a plan to get into medical school to become a doctor. And then eventually, when he realised that she was very much in the palm of his hand, he started talking about the kind of things that he'd like to do, such as, you know, catheterizing the human heart. And she said to him, oh, that would be amazing, or, you know, what an amazing thing to do. And she said to him, and he said, you know, I've got this problem that nobody will allow me to do this, obviously, you know, it's deemed unethical to do this. And she said, well, why don't you do it on me? And he said, all right. So they went into the operating theatre, and she lay down on the operating table, and he strapped her down, and he put some iodine on her arm where he was going to make the incision, and then he said, okay, I'm just going to go and do something, I'll be back. So she's lying there waiting and waiting. He's actually gone away, taken the iodine, got the rubber tubing that he needed, and performed the procedure on himself. So he's standing there, sort of across the operating theatre, out of her sight, pushing a rubber tube into his arm, all the way up, so that it would eventually, you know, having measured the length that he needed, that it would go into his heart. And when he realised that he'd managed to get it into his heart, and that he was still alive, and nothing had really gone wrong, he went back to Gerda Ditson, who was lying there on the table, still strapped down. Turned out she was furious with him for doing this on himself and not on her, which eventually he calmed her down, and after he calmed her down, he unstrapped her from the table. And he said, I'm feeling a little bit wobbly at the moment, but we need to go downstairs to the X-ray department, and there we can take an X-ray of this, and then we can publish it. And so she helped him down the stairs, and they went into the X-ray department. The X-ray technician who was on duty took one look at what was going on. This guy with a tube out of his arm realised what he'd done, or that there was something really not good going on here, and said, you know, I've got to go and get help. Ran out of the X-ray room to get his boss. Meanwhile, Forsman and Dixon sort of set up the shot so they were ready to take this X-ray. Just as they were about to take the X-ray, the chief X-ray technician comes in, running in, having been told what's going on. It says, there's no way you're doing this. I'm the X-ray technician, I'm in charge of this department, and there's no way you're doing this on my watch. And started tugging the tube out of Forsman's arm. Always get a nice reaction. And Forsman thinks, well, I haven't gone through all of this just to, you know, for some X-ray technician to stop me now. And so he starts kicking his shins. And so they're having this fight, and you know, there's one pulling on the tube, and Forsman's kicking his shins. And eventually the X-ray technician says, oh, do you know what, do it, just do it. I don't care, just not, you know, I was never here. And so they do it, so they take the X-ray, and it shows that he's put a tube all the way up his arm into his heart. Forsman takes this X-ray picture to his boss, who had forbidden him to do this procedure, and his boss said, this is fantastic, this is going to put us on the map. And of course completely turns around the idea that this is unethical and not to be done at any cost, and says we've got to publish this as soon as possible, but we mustn't let anyone know how it actually happened. So when they published this, this sort of groundbreaking piece of research, they just lied about how it happened. They made up something about how it was done by a team of people, and everyone was involved, was consenting, it was all done on the proper procedures. And that was how the world got to learn about the fact that you can catheterize the human heart for drug delivery and diagnosis. That's something that happens to millions of people around the world every year now. And about 10 years later, Forsman won a Nobel Prize for this particular work, which involved kind of fighting fraud and deception and all kinds of unethical conduct. And actually, this is my favourite kind of story of science, because what it shows is that scientists are willing to kind of go the extra mile, do all these extra things, and they're kind of normal human beings. You know, in any other field, you know, it's okay to be that passionate and that sort of determined that you're going to push on through and pass all these obstacles. And scientists are no different in many ways. Let me run through very quickly a couple of other examples. So you have people like Kary Mullis, who invented the polymerase chain reaction that's used for DNA fingerprinting. And in order to do it, he knew what he had to do was kind of work out how you take DNA apart and put it back together again. And the way that he worked out how to do that was to train his brain. And basically, he started manufacturing psychedelic chemicals so that he could then imagine himself. So while he was tripping, basically imagine himself down there with the molecule, as he put it. And just kind of playing with it, pulling it apart, seeing what happened. So he says, I trained my brain so that I could imagine myself sort of the same size as a molecule of DNA and able to play with it and do things with it. And after, he only told people this after he'd won the Nobel Prize, by the way. This is another important thing, is that you mustn't be too honest about your methods too soon. So after he won the Nobel Prize, Kary Mullis said, what if I had not taken LSD ever? Would I have invented PCR, polymerase chain reaction? I don't know, I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. And it's kind of this sort of willingness to kind of go the extra mile, to do things that that people don't approve of because you want to get your science done. There's another man, Steve Jobs, who said that taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things I've done in my life. And in the book I describe actually the whole ethos of Silicon Valley during the sort of 70s and 80s was of using a lot of sort of mind-opening chemicals that would allow you to then sort of invent new things that people couldn't possibly conceive of. So the whole idea of graphical user interfaces and those sort of fractal geometries and the way that computers were used to visualize things actually has a lot to do with certain illicit substances that were used at the time. Intel actually, in the 80s, Intel had a drugs policy in place. Their shareholders said that all employees must go through a drugs testing procedure once a month or every 6 months or something. And Intel actually has to have a sort of secret procedure in place where they help their employees pass all these drug tests, because they knew they wouldn't pass them, and they knew that without some of the drugs, none of their engineers would actually be as useful as they were. Sorry, I missed. Carl Sagan got himself arrested because he cared so much about the research that he'd done on the effects of a nuclear winter. And none of his fellow physicists were actually listening to the stories that he was telling about, the calculations that he'd done about nuclear proliferation in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was just building up loads and loads of nuclear warheads. And Sagan couldn't get anybody to listen to what the dire consequences would be. And so he ended up going to a nuclear test site in Nevada, climbing over the fence with a bunch of hippies and getting himself arrested and getting into that place where he could talk about it in the newspapers and actually change the conversation that they were having. The price of a criminal record wasn't too much for him. And you get the scientists who can do, cheaty kind of things, sneaky kind of things, like Albert Einstein, who actually published 8 proofs of E equals mc squared, not one of which was right. All involved some fudges or others. In fact, he got to the point where I think it was the 3rd or the 4th proof, he actually put footnotes in saying something like, of course this isn't rigorous, but we'll carry on anyway. And other people had actually proved E equals mc squared at this point. And everyone knew it was true. But Einstein actually wasn't a very good mathematician, but his reputation was such that he could get away with sort of publishing these sort of not quite complete proofs. During the time, he was quite sort of proprietorial about the equation, but by the end of his life, he realised that he hadn't really properly proved it to anybody. And so when he wrote his autobiographical notes, he talked about all of his sort of big discoveries in science. It's about 10 years before he died, but E equals mc squared was one he left out. He didn't even mention it because he knew by that point that everyone had rumbled him, basically. Sneaky, nasty. I don't have time to tell the story, but Arthur Eddington, the most famous astronomer in Europe at the time, basically took on Subrahmanyan Chandrasekhar, who discovered that a star of a certain mass would collapse to form a black hole. Eddington hated the idea of a black hole sort of ripping a hole in space and time, and he ripped Chandra's career apart, very deliberately, very publicly, destroyed the man, to the point where Chandra said, I'd settled at that point I would just become a second-class scientist. He'd been so thoroughly taken down by Eddington, for reasons that nobody really understands, that Chandra basically gave up on being a good scientist. There was Galileo. We all know the narrative of Galileo taking on the Pope, and the silly Pope not wanting, locking him up and everything else. I mean, the Pope was quite open to arguments and wanted to hear what Galileo had to say. An interesting aspect of this is that Galileo thought that the most convincing argument about showing that the Earth goes around the Sun was to do with the tides moving in and out. And he did all the maths about how the spinning of the Earth on its axis and the rotation around the Sun would create these sort of sloshing of water back and forth. And he did the maths and he came out with the tides coming back in and out. And he thought this was fantastic. He said this was the most convincing proof that the Earth goes around the Sun. Unfortunately, his maths gave him 1 tide per day, 1 high tide per day. And if he was living somewhere landlocked, that would have been okay, but he was in Venice at the time. And everybody kind of knew that there were 2 high tides a day and that his maths was wrong. But he was having none of it, actually. He just told everyone to shut up. And published it anyway. So scientists display all these kind of different tricks. Crick and Watson were quite happy to defy their bosses and carry on with their work on DNA in secret. They also stole data from Rosalind Franklin quite deliberately, and Crick later referred to it as a burglary, basically. But this was the most important data to them, which they used for their proof of the structure of the double helix of DNA. And they didn't bother even including Franklin in their paper, which won them the Nobel Prize. And then a guy at the University of Nottingham called David Pritchard, who uses hookworms to study the effects of the immune system, the effects that the hookworm larvae have on our immune system. And he basically started this because he was in Papua New Guinea and realised that Papua New Guineans who had a severe hookworm infection, were having less incidence of asthma and allergies and things like that. And so he started studying this, and he eventually ended up, he got a bit tired of sort of taking hookworm larvae through customs out of Papua New Guinea. He'd always be asked all these questions about what they were for. And he realised he could just infect himself with them and to give himself a critical dose, effectively, and take them back to study in his lab in Nottingham. Apparently, So eventually he got to the point where he was putting them on plasters and letting them burrow into his skin and see what the effects were and see how many hookworm larvae was a good infection rate, and then he could study his own immune system. Turns out 12 larvae is about right, 24 is way too many, he says. But now he has a colleague who actually has a permanent infection of hookworm larvae, so that when they need more studies, he just sort of disappears off to the loo and brings back some more. There's a whole load of people in Nottingham area now participating in clinical trials, because this is being seen as a possible solution to Crohn's disease and MS, as well as allergic reactions. So, but this idea that you would sort of self-infect yourself, there's the famous story of Barry Marshall, who discovered that Helicobacter pylori, the spiral bacterium, would cause stomach ulcers, and the only way he could actually prove it in the end, he tried all the conventional methods. In the end, he just drank a cupful of these bacteria, made himself very ill, but got the infection, got the stomach ulcer, everything he needed to prove that he was right, and again won himself a Nobel Prize for this kind of bravery. So these are the kinds of things that scientists actually are, and scientists actually do. These are kind of maybe extreme examples, but I think you'll agree they're kind of human beings. They're kind of, they're great stories. They're like the stories that we have with artists and musicians, this kind of creative, reckless, kind of daring, and sometimes nasty kinds of people, normal human beings, which don't really come to the fore when people are thinking about what a scientist really is. So the question I'm going to ask now, and go through this quite quickly, is why don't we know this? And the interesting answer to this, I think is really interesting, is that actually we don't know it because scientists didn't want us to know it. So we had the situation at the end of the Second World War, the sort of early 1950s, where Jacob Bronowski, the geneticist, can say, people hate science, there's no use beating about the bush here. Which is quite a shocking thing to say in an age of BBC Science and Horizon and Brian Cox. People love science at the moment, I would say. People are very sort of into science. And science is seen as a positive thing. That's a very hard-won point of view to have. So people hate science, Bronowski said. And actually you can get this from children as well. So once you've got them to draw their scientist for you, you then say, okay, thanks for that, draw me another scientist. And the second scientist that the children draw is always doing crazy, horrible things. And so, we have this sort of cultural stereotype that comes out of the scientist, creating a Frankenstein's monster, or doing something unspeakable to a lab rat. This Norwegian one here says danger, the crazy research going on. And the crazy mad scientist is the other stereotype that we have. And it's only just underneath the surface of how we perceive science. And the reason for that is that actually, at the end of the Second World War, and for many decades afterwards, people were very scared of science. And we had a situation where we had the V2 rockets that rained down on London. We had the terrible things that the Nazi scientists and the Japanese scientists did to prisoners of war. We had the things that our own doctors did to our own troops in tests of chemical weapons and things like that. And these things started to come out just after the war. And and of course the atomic bomb. And people started to wonder, what science was going to do. It was going to destroy us all. These scientists were not to be trusted. To the point where you have somebody like Winston Churchill willing to say something like, the Stone Age may return on the gleaming wings of science, and it's arguable whether the human race have been gainers by the march of science beyond the steam engine, give me the horse. You have this real sort of post-war hatred of science, or the fear of science. And actually the scientists were very aware of this, and there was a very concerted PR effort to do something about it. And so the Royal Society was very proactive in this, and would write letters, and there's lots of memos between the Royal Society and the BBC, for instance, in these couple of decades, where the BBC is doing documentaries about how science is going to destroy us all. And the Royal Society is writing these memos saying, can't you talk about how science is going to feed the world and it's going to make the world a much better place? To the point where the Royal Society actually restricted access to scientists. So if the BBC wanted to do a documentary inside the science lab, the Royal Society would push certain scientists onto the screen, ones that would portray science in the right way. And there were certain scientists who were blacklisted, who were not allowed to appear on TV, because they might say something dangerous and inflammatory about the perils of science. And so we had this kind of concerted PR effort that went on for a few decades, really. And the thing was that because people were afraid of science, the message that came across was science had to portray itself with certain qualities. So Bronowski said the scientist became the monk of our age, timid and thwarted, anxious to be asked to help. So science became very much a servant, or a humble servant of the people. And you got the situation where science would portray itself as kind of safe and trustworthy, disciplined, objective, impersonal, never wrong, grounded in experimental results. You could trust science. It was a safe pair of hands. But actually, in the end, what happened was it kind of dehumanized science. And people were taught in the 1950s to write their scientific papers, for instance, in the passive tense. So you take out the idea that there's even a human being involved in this. And there's some interesting correspondence in some of the journals around this time about whether this is a good thing or not. But actually, so when Einstein was writing papers in the 1930s and 40s, he would sometimes write, well, I had this jolly exchange with Max Planck, and it would be a very sort of conversational tone in his papers. And actually, by the sort of 50s and 60s, there was no hint of a human being in science. When I learned science at school, I was taught to write up my laboratory experiments in the passive tense. An experiment was done. There was no human involved whatsoever. And this dehumanization, it's sort of, or this sort of application of these kinds of standards seems like a good idea. But actually, I think if you read it a different way, acrostically, you can find that actually we've got staid, dull, and boring. This is the subtext. This is what we're getting. This is where we get this kind of idea that the scientist is somewhat, not really quite human, not quite the same as the rest of us. They don't really operate in the same way as us. And actually, this has consequences. And I think it really does matter. And I'll run through them very quickly. So there's a piece of research by someone called Harry Scoffin, who studied the kinds of children that carried on with science and the kinds that dropped it at 14 when they were taking options, when they were allowed to choose which way they went. And what she found was that actually in her study, all the highly socialized children stuck with humanities kind of subjects as much as possible, the arts subjects, and it was the introverts and the kind of less socialized children who were left studying the sciences. I don't know how many of you are science students. I'm kind of subtly insulting everyone in science at this point by saying you're kind of slightly weird, introverted people. But I was one of them. But there's this sense that actually this kind of not quite human, not quite normal, not quite sociable, not quite able to interact, that's the scientist. And if I don't feel like I'm that kind of person, then I'm not going to do science. And so actually what we're doing with that, there's a report in the Times a couple of years ago, which is quite interesting. Children shun science because of the geek image. And what happens is actually, it's sort of funny, you sort of think, oh, that's funny, all scientists are geeks. What happens is you lose the kind of extrovert, risk-taking aspects of science. So with this subtle kind of shift, and I think it probably reinforces itself, you lose the kind of kids who would be innovative and creative and risk-taking and do. So down the line, when you've got these people in research careers, you find that actually what you have is people doing staid science in many ways, you can argue. And you get very few and far between other scientists who will take risks and do things that say, like Werner Forssmann did, where they go outside of the authority that's placed over them. So I think it can have consequences for the kind of science that you get. It has consequences as well. When we have this sort of fear of science, you get all these reports in the newspapers about whether the LHC is going to blow up the world, the Large Hadron Collider. Well, the idea was, it was reported quite seriously that there was a chance that when this machine turned on, the world would disappear in a gigantic black hole. Although nobody really believed that was possible or that it would happen, it was kind of raised there, and we're used to these stories, scare stories about what scientists are doing and what they will do. We very much have the same debate going on with genetically modified crops. We don't trust the scientists to do it right, and perhaps quite rightly we don't. And I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but we have a kind of difficult relationship with science. There's issues over nuclear power, and the fact that our nuclear power stations in the UK, for instance, were built to a design that would maximise the output of warhead fissile material. So they weren't built to be efficient power generating power stations. And there's these issues about whether science is kind of used for other purposes that we don't really know about. all hangovers of this kind of post-war fear. And then, the issue of the genomic revolution. What are they going to do with our genomes? What can they do? What are they going to do? They're going to alter our genomes. They're going to start to make these chimera animal-human hybrids. There's all kinds of stuff going on. We don't really have a good, healthy relationship with science and scientists, so we can have these debates properly. So you get these ridiculous sort of polarizations, as happened, with the GM debate. I don't think we can actually have a proper debate over genetic modification because everything has become so polarized in our mindset. There's also the danger that scientists have a relatively new career. Post-war, governments realized that whoever had the best scientist was going to win the next war, and so actually they invested enormously, and it became possible to have a career as a university scientist, with tenure, with pensions, with everything working out very well for you. So scientists actually became these kind of tools of the establishment, as it were, and they became these people who would say, oh yes, we can do this, we can do that, and were servants of the establishment. And so you have this kind of sense that scientists grew, and this is a quote from a guy, Robert White Stevens, who was a chemist, who stood very firmly against the silent spring phenomenon in the end of the 1950s, when there was a massive use of chemicals to destroy all insect life in America, basically. And Rachel Carson stood up against this and said, actually, this is a bad thing. It's killing lots of, that's when we started to understand food chains and ecosystems. And his response was, we're going to take control of nature. And that was very much the kind of ethos of the time, is that science will give us the tools to take control of nature without much kind of self-awareness of limitations. And then the problem with this kind of being a tool of the establishment, as far as sort of creating science for the economy, for the war machine, that kind of thing, is that scientists were very much government employees, and they were taught very much not to rock the boat. And so when they discovered things like the fact that CFC gases were destroying the ozone layer, one man kind of came out and said, and campaigned very strongly, a guy called Sherwood Rowland, and the rest of his colleagues shunned him for it. And for 10 years, although he was one of the most senior chemists in America, he was not invited to give a talk in any department across the whole of North America, because he was seen as campaigning. And they said, you're not supposed to campaign, you're a scientist, you're supposed to report the science. And his response was, what's the use of having developed the science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? Which is actually kind of what happened in the end, was we discovered a massive hole in the ozone layer over the Antarctic, and that's when we sort of finally acted. The scientists did nothing. Carl Sagan, we've already mentioned, who believed that scientists had a job to do. They had to alert the public to the possible dangers. He was denied membership of the National Academy of Sciences because he was seen as a dangerous element and far too involved with the public. And then there's James Hansen, who resigned from NASA a couple of years ago. He was the head of NASA Goddard Research Laboratories. He resigned because government employees are not allowed to sue the government in the US. So he resigned so that he could then start a lawsuit against the government over their inaction over climate change. And his voice is, do we not know enough to say more? So scientists, in the end, have sort of put themselves in a position where there are certain problems with our public perception of them, and also of the way they perceive themselves. And really, I think these are issues that need airing and addressing, and I haven't got time to go into these anymore, so all I'll do is flog my books, which I haven't brought any with me. They're on Amazon. If you want to know more of the stories and about what scientists really get up to, get involved with, The Secret Anarchy of Science is, I think, about £6 on Amazon. And then in July there'll be this one. It's called At the Edge of Uncertainty, which is a kind of look at what scientists are doing right now, very much at the sort of cutting edge of science. And having been shamelessly commercial, I'll stop now and take some questions. Thank you.